In the near future, around 2012, the United States faces a devastating economic collapse. Millions lose their jobs, poverty spreads rapidly, and crime surges across the country. With prisons overflowing beyond capacity, the government hands control of correctional facilities over to private corporations that operate them strictly for profit. One such facility, Terminal Island Penitentiary, begins broadcasting brutal inmate cage matches online. Prisoners fighting each other to the death quickly attract massive audiences, turning violence into entertainment. Eventually, viewers grow tired of simple brawls and demand something more thrilling. To keep ratings high, the prison introduces a new spectacle known as the death race, a deadly competition where inmates drive heavily armed, modified vehicles in high-speed races. The prize for surviving multiple races is freedom itself. During the latest broadcast, only 2 competitors remain on the track. One car is piloted by the mysterious masked racer known as Frankenstein, accompanied by his navigator, Case. Chasing closely behind is Frankenstein's longtime rival, the ruthless Machine Gun Joe. Both drivers push their vehicles to the limit as the finish line approaches, fully prepared to destroy one another to claim victory. Suddenly, Frankenstein realizes his onboard weapons have stopped functioning. Forced to improvise, he deploys the vehicle's rear defensive shield, slamming it backward into Joe's car and briefly slowing him down. Despite the setback, Joe quickly regains control and prepares another attack. Case realizes they are moments away from being obliterated and begs to abandon the race, convinced Joe will kill them both. Frankenstein refuses to surrender victory. With no other option, Case ejects herself from the vehicle just as Frankenstein crosses the finish line. At that exact moment, Joe fires a devastating shot that causes Frankenstein's car to explode, securing the win but destroying the vehicle in the process. Several days later, far from the prison, factory worker and former convict Jensen Ames receives crushing news. The steel plant where he works is shutting down, and management refuses to fully compensate the employees for their final wages. Frustration spreads among the workers, and tensions quickly escalate outside the facility. Riot police arrive almost immediately, responding aggressively and striking workers at the slightest sign of resistance. Watching his co-workers being beaten pushes Jensen past his limit, and he joins the confrontation, fighting back against the officers before chaos finally dies down. By the time Jensen returns home that evening, exhaustion weighs heavily on him. He greets his wife warmly before heading upstairs to check on their infant daughter. While he is distracted, a masked intruder quietly enters the house. The stranger brutally murders Jensen's wife in the kitchen. When Jensen comes back downstairs moments later, the attacker knocks him unconscious, places the weapon in Jensen's hand, and silently leaves after mimicking a gunshot gesture with a gloved finger. Jensen regains consciousness surrounded by police officers, only to realize he is being arrested for his wife's murder. Despite his confusion and protests, the evidence appears undeniable. 6 months later, Jensen is transported to Terminal Island Prison. Upon arrival, guard Ulrich greets him with deliberate cruelty, blasting him with freezing water and allowing another officer to strike him before escorting him to a crowded cell. Inside wait 3 inmates eager to establish dominance through violence. Later, Ulrich returns expecting to witness Jensen injured or broken, but instead finds all 3 prisoners unconscious. Jensen has defended himself with ease. The following morning, Jensen enters the mess hall for breakfast. Several inmates, Coach, Gunner, and Lists, observe him closely. Lists recognizes Jensen as a once promising professional driver whose past mistake destroyed his racing career. The atmosphere suddenly turns tense when a dangerous inmate named Pachenko approaches alongside an accomplice. Seeking trouble, Pachenko spits into Jensen's food and loudly insults him, accusing him of murdering his wife and harming his child. Unable to tolerate the taunts, Jensen attacks Pachenko, and the two begin a violent fight before guards intervene and drag Jensen away. Instead of punishment, however, he is escorted to meet the prison's warden, Claire Hennessy. Hennessy has already reviewed Jensen's history and knows about his exceptional driving skills. She presents him with an unusual proposal. The legendary racer Frankenstein, the prison's most famous competitor, actually died during surgery after the previous race, but the public has not been informed. Because Frankenstein always raced behind a mask, anyone could assume the identity. Frankenstein had become the audience's favorite symbol of survival and rebellion, and since his death, viewership numbers have dropped sharply. Hennessy intends to keep the legend alive to restore the show's popularity, and she wants Jensen to step into the role. According to death race rules, any driver who wins 5 races earns release from prison. Frankenstein had already secured 4 victories, meaning Jensen would only need to survive and win 1 more race to gain his freedom. Jensen hesitates, realizing the offer could easily cost him his life. But Hennessy makes it clear that refusal is not truly an option. If he declines, she will place him in permanent solitary confinement to ensure her secret remains hidden. Faced with an impossible choice, Jensen understands that entering the death race may be his only chance to ever leave the prison alive. With no real alternative left, Jensen reluctantly agrees to Hennessy's proposal. Soon after, guards escort him to the prison's massive auto shop, the heart of the death race operation. There, he meets Coach along with the mechanics responsible for maintaining Frankenstein's vehicle. Coach and his crew explain that they will handle the technical side of things while helping Jensen learn everything he needs to survive on the track. Each racing team operates out of its own designated pit area, and cooperation between teams simply doesn't exist. Everyone looks out only for themselves. Nearby stands a much larger workshop sealed off from the rest of the garage, where Hennessy has reportedly been constructing something mysterious for over a month. Very few people inside the prison know that Jensen is replacing the original Frankenstein. Aside from his pit crew and a handful of trusted guards, the truth remains hidden, largely because Hennessy's authority within Terminal Island goes completely unquestioned. Coach finally reveals Jensen's vehicle, a heavily modified Mustang V8 Fastback, rebuilt into a deadly racing machine. The car is equipped with numerous offensive weapons and defensive systems designed specifically for the death race. However, ammunition isn't installed until race day to prevent inmates from attempting escapes using armed vehicles. Even if someone tried, escape would be nearly impossible. Terminal Island sits isolated offshore, connected to the mainland by a single narrow bridge that would instantly swarm with police units and helicopters at the first sign of a breakout. After Jensen familiarizes himself with the car, the team gathers in the prison yard to continue explaining how the competition works. The death race unfolds across 3 stages. During the first 2 phases, drivers are encouraged to eliminate as many rivals as possible. The final stage, however, becomes a pure sprint where speed and survival determine who reaches the finish line first. Every driver is paired with a navigator, typically women transferred from a nearby female correctional facility. These navigators assist with route planning and weapon systems. Machine Gun Joe stands as the lone exception. Instead of female navigators, he prefers one of his own crew members, mainly because his previous partners rarely survived long enough, something that even the bloodthirsty audience found uncomfortable to watch. Lists begins pointing out the most dangerous competitors currently roaming the yard. Among them is 14K, a highly intelligent triad member who once studied at MIT, Hector Grimm, an unstable fanatic who idolizes Warden Hennessy, Slovo Pachenko, the powerful leader of the prison's Aryan Brotherhood faction, and Travis Colt, a former NASCAR celebrity whose career ended in disgrace before landing him behind bars. Their conversation is abruptly interrupted when Machine Gun Joe arrives with his crew. Joe mocks Jensen openly, delivering a warning meant for Frankenstein himself. According to Joe, the upcoming race is a personal showdown between the two of them. After making his threat clear, Joe walks away, leaving tension hanging in the air. At that moment, a transport van pulls into the yard carrying inmates returning from outside work duty. Jensen notices something unusual. Each prisoner wears a GPS tracking bracelet around their wrist. The sight immediately triggers a memory. The man who murdered his wife had been wearing the exact same device. The realization unsettles Jensen deeply, suggesting the killer may have come from inside the prison system itself. Eventually, race day arrives for the first stage of the death race. Jensen is handed Frankenstein's signature outfit, including the iconic mask and even the champion's ring. The moment he appears dressed as Frankenstein, audience numbers surge again, proving how much viewers missed the legendary racer. Coach advises Jensen to remain silent around the other drivers since Frankenstein rarely spoke, and that mystery had become part of his reputation. Inside the car, however, Jensen may remove the mask because the windows are made from mirrored glass, preventing outsiders from seeing his face. Case, already aware of the secret, joins him as navigator once more. While preparing for the race, Jensen asks Case what landed her in prison. She casually admits that she killed a police officer, claiming the man had abused his family and deserved what happened to him. Their conversation ends as engines roar to life and the race officially begins. Since vehicle weapons remain inactive until the second lap of 3, the opening moments rely mostly on aggressive driving rather than outright destruction. Even so, competitors constantly attempt to ram one another off the track. Guided by Case's familiarity with the course, Jensen quickly pushes toward the front of the pack, eventually challenging Machine Gun Joe for the lead. When Case identifies a hidden shortcut, Jensen takes advantage of it and briefly claims first place. That's when Hennessy activates the combat systems. Weapons and defensive abilities are triggered by special panels embedded in the track, marked manholes that drivers must roll over with all 4 wheels to unlock their car's upgrades. Almost immediately, gunfire erupts across the course. Chaos intensifies further when Hennessy unleashes the deadly track hazards known as death heads. Hector Grimm wastes no time using one to destroy a weaker competitor by forcing their vehicle directly into it. Grimm later slows Machine Gun Joe by spraying oil across his path, but his success is short-lived. Driver 14K retaliates by firing a missile that sends Grimm crashing off the track, where Joe finishes him off by running over the wreckage. Meanwhile, Jensen successfully activates his weapons, but his mounted machine gun suddenly jams. Without hesitation, Case climbs onto the hood mid-race to repair it, instantly drawing heavy fire from the other drivers. Jensen relies on precise driving skills to evade the barrage, swerving through bullets until Case fixes the problem and safely returns to her seat. Jensen later captures a defensive activation panel ahead of Travis Colt, but just like during Frankenstein's previous race, his defensive systems malfunction, leaving the rear shield barely holding together under enemy fire. Thinking quickly, Jensen improvises. He instructs Case to detach the napalm system and climb onto his lap while he ejects her seat loaded with the explosive fuel toward an opponent. The improvised attack strikes Colt's vehicle directly. Covered in napalm, Colt becomes an easy target when Case tosses the car's lighter onto the spill, igniting the vehicle in flames and forcing Colt out of the race. With another rival eliminated, Jensen once again finds himself battling Machine Gun Joe for position. But in the middle of the chase, his attention suddenly shifts when Pachenko pulls alongside him and makes a familiar hand gesture, the exact same motion the masked man made on the night Jensen's wife was murdered. Machine Gun Joe quickly capitalizes on Jensen's momentary distraction. Slamming into Jensen's vehicle, Joe forces him off his racing line and sends him dropping to last place while Pachenko surges ahead to claim first. By the end of the stage, 3 drivers have been killed, leaving only 6 competitors alive to continue into the next round of the death race. After the race concludes, Coach and the mechanics carefully inspect Frankenstein's car. To their confusion, every system appears fully functional. The weapons and defenses show no mechanical faults, leaving no clear explanation for why the equipment failed during critical moments on the track. Convinced something far bigger is happening, Jensen demands a meeting with Warden Hennessy. He confronts her directly, declaring he refuses to continue racing. Jensen explains that he now recognizes Pachenko as the man responsible for murdering his wife and believes the entire situation was orchestrated to frame him. All so Hennessy could replace the original Frankenstein with a new driver. Hennessy neither confirms nor denies the accusation. Instead, she calmly presents Jensen with a photograph of his young daughter along with information about the foster home where the child has been placed. The message is unmistakable. If Jensen wants any chance of seeing his daughter again, he must continue cooperating. Realizing he has no leverage, Jensen leaves with no choice but to comply. Back in the yard, Jensen speaks with Coach, curious about something he has noticed. Coach doesn't wear a prisoner number like everyone else. Coach reveals that he technically earned parole 3 years earlier. However, when the time came to leave, he couldn't bring himself to step outside the prison gates. The world beyond had changed too drastically, while the races and the garage offered a strange sense of familiarity and purpose. Coach also admits he never believed Jensen was capable of killing his wife. Later that evening, while working near the pits, Jensen spots Pachenko walking nearby. Driven by anger and suspicion, Jensen secretly follows him into his team's area. The move backfires when Pachenko's crew captures him. Pachenko lands several heavy punches before grabbing a large tool, clearly intending to crush Jensen's skull regardless of any protection the warden might have promised him. Before he can strike, Liszt suddenly intervenes, stabbing Pachenko in the back with a pen. The brief distraction gives Jensen an opening. He grabs a sharp piece of metal from the ground and stabs one of his captors, then quickly incapacitates the remaining attackers. Free again, Jensen turns his fury toward Pachenko. He violently assaults him, throwing him across the pit and smashing him into equipment until Pachenko finally confesses. Hennessy ordered the murder, and guard Ulrich personally transported him to Jensen's home that night. Enraged, Jensen prepares to kill Pachenko on the spot, but Ulrich arrives with another guard and forcibly ends the confrontation before Jensen can finish it. The following day, moments before the second stage begins, Pachenko once again taunts Jensen with the same mocking hand gesture connected to his wife's murder. This time, Jensen refuses to react emotionally. Instead, once the race starts, he deliberately slows down and steers into a tunnel section of the track, creating a private moment to speak with Case. Suspicion weighing on him, Jensen confronts her. The repeated equipment failures seem too convenient, and he demands the truth, threatening to eject her from the car if she lies. Under pressure, Case finally confesses. She sabotaged Frankenstein's rear weapons during previous races because Hennessy promised her early release in exchange. The intention had never been to kill Frankenstein, only to make him lose so he would remain imprisoned and continue racing for entertainment. His death happened because he kept pushing for victory despite having no working weapons. Now understanding the full situation, Jensen accelerates back into the race, smoothly rejoining the competition. For the moment, he ignores Machine Gun Joe. His true target is Pachenko. The two drivers aggressively attempt to force each other off the track, but neither gains the upper hand. Jensen suddenly speeds ahead and deliberately activates a weapons panel instead of a defensive one, confusing the spectators and drivers alike since the weapons are mounted at the front of his car. Then Jensen pulls an unexpected maneuver, spinning the vehicle around and driving backward while unleashing gunfire directly at Pachenko. After heavily damaging the rival car, Jensen spins forward again into poised smoke, causing Pachenko to lose visibility and crash violently into a concrete barrier. Jensen then stops his vehicle, steps out onto the track, and approaches the wreck. Without hesitation, he snaps Pachenko's neck, taking revenge for his wife's murder. With chaos unfolding, and Machine Gun Joe even switching navigators mid-race, Hennessy decides it's time to unveil the secret project she has been preparing. She releases a massive armored tanker truck known as the Dreadnot. The enormous vehicle bristles with weapons and quickly proves nearly unstoppable. It rapidly closes the distance to the racers and destroys two lesser competitors almost immediately. Because it belongs to the prison administration, the Dreadnot is authorized to drive through restricted buildings, allowing it to cut across the course and suddenly emerge at the front of the race. The truck mercilessly attacks 14K's team, slowly killing his navigator before ensnaring his car with heavy chains. Continuous gunfire tears the vehicle apart until it explodes, leaving only two racers alive, Jensen and Machine Gun Joe. Facing such overwhelming firepower, neither driver can survive alone. Realizing this, Jensen orders Liszt to patch his communicator into Joe's vehicle. The longtime rivals reluctantly agree to cooperate. Working together, they flank the Dreadnot from both sides, weaving through incoming attacks while searching for an opportunity. When a trap activation panel appears ahead, both drivers coordinate perfectly, each rolling over it with two wheels so that together they trigger the mechanism. The hidden trap rises from the track just in time, causing the massive tanker truck to slam directly into it. With the destruction of the Dreadnot, the second stage officially comes to an end. Only two racers remain alive to advance into the final round, Jensen and Machine Gun Joe. That evening, Joe casually walks into Jensen's pit area. Studying him closely, Joe remarks that Frankenstein's voice sounds strangely familiar, almost identical to the original driver's. Still, he chooses not to press the issue, leaving the comment hanging before walking away. Elsewhere, Hennessy and guard Ulrich reach a troubling conclusion. Jensen has become too unpredictable, and since the Frankenstein identity can always be passed on to another inmate, they decide he must be eliminated before he has any chance of actually winning his freedom. The following morning, as preparations for the final race begin, Ulrich secretly plants a bomb beneath Jensen's vehicle. At the same time, Hennessy gathers the prisoners and staff for a dramatic speech, praising the races as the ultimate purpose of their lives. While addressing the crowd, she mentions that this could be the first time a driver earns freedom by securing a fifth victory. Hearing this sparks a realization in Jensen. No racer has ever truly won 5 times because the system is manipulated to eliminate anyone who comes close. The races are designed to maintain the spectacle, not to grant freedom. That means he is never meant to survive today's race either. Coach overhears Jensen's conclusion, and once the team returns to the auto shop, he reviews old race footage with him. Together, they examine the moment of Grimm's crash, noticing a critical structural weakness left behind by the earlier explosion. The discovery inspires Jensen to form a risky plan. He asks Lists to secretly install an additional half-gallon reserve fuel tank into the car before heading over to Joe's pit to propose another temporary alliance. As Jensen prepares for the race and changes into Frankenstein's gear, Hennessy visits him privately. She hands him official release papers, but immediately follows with a new proposition. If Jensen wins, she wants him to remain at Terminal Island and continue racing as Frankenstein permanently. According to her, the track is where he truly belongs. She argues that an ex-convict cannot provide a stable future for his daughter and claims staying behind would actually be an act of selfless love. Jensen gives no response. Instead, he quietly folds the release papers and slips them into his pocket before heading toward the starting line. Once inside the car, Case reveals that Hennessy approached her as well, instructing her to stop Jensen if he appears close to victory. Jensen remains calm, assuring her he already expected something like that. The final race begins moments later. Almost immediately, Ulrich manipulates the track controls so activation panels respond only when Machine Gun Joe drives over them. Armed first, Joe opens fire on Jensen, heavily damaging the rear shield. Realizing it won't hold much longer, Jensen ejects the shield in an attempt to repeat an old trick, but Joe easily avoids it, having learned from past races. To keep viewers engaged, Hennessy activates a defensive panel for Jensen, but Joe destroys it with a rocket before Jensen can use it. Joe launches the rest of his missiles, forcing Jensen into a desperate series of evasive maneuvers. Jensen skillfully dodges each one, allowing the rockets to slam into a nearby wall instead. This is exactly what Jensen and Joe planned. The wall had already been weakened during Grimm's earlier crash. Throughout the race, both drivers have carefully guided attacks toward that fragile section. The final rocket barrage delivers the decisive blow, blasting open a massive breach in the prison perimeter, creating an escape route off Terminal Island. Enraged, Hennessy immediately cuts the broadcast feed and orders every available police unit to intercept them. She presses the detonator meant to destroy Jensen's car, but nothing happens. Unknown to her, Coach and his crew had already discovered the bomb earlier and safely removed it. Jensen and Joe race toward the island bridge as police vehicles close in behind them. It's time for the next step of Jensen's plan. He releases the hidden reserve fuel tank, which crashes into the pursuing vehicles and explodes, creating a towering wall of fire that blocks further pursuit. Both men successfully cross the bridge gates before splitting onto separate roads, forcing the pursuing helicopters to focus entirely on Jensen, the more valuable target. As Joe escapes in the opposite direction, Case agrees to help Jensen complete the final phase of the plan. She feels indebted to the original Frankenstein, and since Hennessy already processed her release paperwork, the authorities will be obligated to free her afterward. As they pass beneath towering construction cranes, Jensen jumps from the moving car into the shadows and hides among the machinery, while Case slides into the driver's seat wearing Frankenstein's outfit and mask. She continues driving only a short distance before helicopters block the road with flames. When Case exits the vehicle with her hands raised, authorities believe they have captured Frankenstein. Since very few people know about the identity swap, she is arrested and transported back to Terminal Island, unknowingly allowing Jensen to disappear. Free at last, Jensen reunites with Machine Gun Joe, and together they board a passing freight train to begin new lives away from the prison system. Back at Terminal Island, Ulrich excitedly reports that viewership ratings have skyrocketed and congratulatory gifts are already arriving for Hennessy. Curious, she opens one of the packages Ulrich delivers, only to discover the bomb that had originally been planted under Jensen's car. Seconds later, it detonates, killing both Ulrich and Hennessy instantly. Outside on the track, Coach is revealed holding the detonator, having ensured their final punishment. 6 months later, Jensen and Joe are living peacefully in Santa Rosalia, Mexico. The former rivals now run their own auto repair shop together, working as partners rather than enemies. Jensen has regained custody of his daughter and finally begun rebuilding his life. Not long after, Case arrives following her official release, bringing along a racing car for them to inspect. A reminder that while the death race is behind them, the road ahead is finally their own. Death Race doesn't open like a movie that wants to introduce itself. It opens like a machine being dropped from the sky. There's no gentle build-up, no slow invitation into the world, no careful attempt to ease the audience into the story. Instead, it comes at you all at once. Engines snarling, explosions tearing through the frame, metal clashing, music pounding, and chaos hitting with enough force to feel almost physical. From the very first moments, the film makes its priorities brutally clear. This is not a story built on subtle tension or emotional delicacy. It is built on impact. Pure, immediate, overwhelming impact. The opening doesn't ask for your patience, it demands your attention. And it does that by throwing you straight into a world of noise, violence, and industrial aggression before you've even had a chance to catch your breath. There's something almost confrontational about the way Death Race begins. It doesn't care whether you're ready. It doesn't care whether you want character nuance first, or world building, or carefully layered suspense. It kicks the door off its hinges and announces exactly what kind of ride this is going to be. Loud, harsh, ruthless, unapologetically excessive. And, in a strange way, that opening honesty becomes one of the film's defining strengths. Because the first few minutes tell you everything you need to know about the experience ahead. This is a movie that wants to hit the senses before it ever touches the mind. It wants the roar of the engines to matter more than the dialogue. It wants the violence to land before the plot fully forms. It wants speed, pressure, and destruction to shape your reaction long before the deeper weaknesses of the story begin to show. The result is an opening that feels less like the beginning of a traditional film and more like being launched into a live-action combat arena. The editing is aggressive. The sound design is relentless. The imagery is packed with steel, sparks, smoke, and motion. Everything is engineered to create one immediate sensation, overload, and that overload is not accidental. It's the entire point. This is where Death Race reveals its true nature. Not as a slow-burn dystopian thriller, not as a thoughtful science fiction drama, but as a full-throttle sensory assault dressed up as a movie. It behaves more like a weaponized adrenaline rush than a carefully measured narrative. Every choice in that opening is built around force. Force in the visuals, force in the soundtrack, force in the pacing, force in the attitude. It's almost as if the film understands that if it slows down for even a moment, you might start asking questions it doesn't really want to answer. So instead, it keeps slamming forward. That first blast of energy gives the movie a very specific identity. It doesn't feel elegant. It doesn't feel refined. It feels brutal, industrial, and deliberately abrasive. The world of Death Race isn't introduced through exposition-heavy dialogue or complex setup. It's introduced through sensation, through violence, through machinery, through raw cinematic pressure. And for some viewers, that opening will feel exhilarating. Because whether you admire it or resist it, there's no denying that the film arrives with conviction. It commits instantly, no hesitation, no apology. It knows exactly the tone it wants, and it locks into it from frame one. That kind of confidence, however blunt, can be effective. You may not call it sophisticated, but you can't call it timid. What makes the opening even more interesting is how completely it shapes your expectations for everything that follows. Once the film starts this aggressively, it has already made a promise. This experience is going to be driven by momentum, noise, and destruction. The story can catch up later if it wants to, but first, the film wants to overwhelm you, and that's exactly what it does. The opening of Death Race is not about immersion in the traditional sense. It's about impact. It's about grabbing the audience by the throat and dragging them into the film's world through sheer force of style. There's no subtle handoff into the narrative. The movie doesn't walk onto the track, it crashes onto it, and in doing so, it establishes one of the clearest identities in modern action cinema, not a movie inviting you to think, but a movie daring you to survive the ride. Once that explosive opening settles, if it ever really does, Death Race makes something even clearer. This isn't just a loud movie, it's a movie that has no interest in being anything more than loud. Because beneath all the crashing metal and roaring engines, there's a very deliberate choice at the core of this film. It does not want to be a serious drama. It does not want to challenge you emotionally. It does not want to slow down and explore its own ideas. It wants to move. It wants to hit. And then it wants to move again. That's the identity of Death Race, a fully committed, unapologetic thrill machine. You can feel it in the way scenes are constructed. Dialogue is short, functional, almost disposable. Characters aren't explored, they're positioned. Emotions don't build, they're implied and then pushed aside for the next explosion. Even the story itself feels less like something being told and more like something being used as fuel. And that's the key difference. A serious drama uses action to serve the story. Death Race uses the story to serve the action. Everything becomes secondary to momentum. If a scene isn't pushing the film forward with speed, tension, or violence, it doesn't linger. It gets out of the way. The movie behaves like it's allergic to stillness. It refuses to pause long enough for you to sit with anything, because the moment you do, you might start looking for depth that simply isn't there. And strangely, that's where the film becomes honest. Because Death Race never pretends to be profound. It doesn't dress itself up as something meaningful and then fail to deliver. It knows exactly what it is. A high-impact, disposable experience designed to entertain in the moment and move on. There's almost a mechanical efficiency to it. You sit down. It hits you with noise, speed, and destruction. You feel the adrenaline. And when it's over, it lets go. No lingering emotional weight, no lasting psychological impact, no deep themes demanding reflection. Just a clean, blunt cycle of stimulation and release. And for some audiences, that's not a flaw, it's the appeal. Because there's a certain satisfaction in a film that doesn't waste time pretending. In an era where many action movies try to balance spectacle with forced emotional depth, Death Race strips everything back to its most basic function, entertainment through intensity. But that simplicity comes with a cost. Because the more the film commits to being a thrill machine, the more it sacrifices everything else. The characters never fully come alive. The stakes rarely feel personal. The world, despite its potential, becomes just a backdrop for destruction rather than something meaningful to explore. You're watching events unfold, but you're not truly feeling them. There's a distance that forms, a detachment. You're engaged by the spectacle, but not connected to the consequences. And that's the trade-off the film makes from the very beginning. It chooses impact over insight, speed over substance, momentum over meaning, and it never looks back. What makes this choice interesting isn't just that the film makes it, it's how completely it commits to it. There's no hesitation, no internal conflict about tone. Death Race doesn't flirt with being something deeper. It doesn't set up emotional complexity and then abandon it halfway through. It stays in its lane. And that lane is pure, aggressive, high-octane escapism. So when you watch Death Race, the real question isn't whether it succeeds as a drama because it's not trying to be one. The real question is this: how much are you willing to trade for adrenaline? Because this film asks you to give up depth, character, and emotional weight in exchange for raw, unfiltered spectacle. And depending on what you came for, that trade might feel either brutally empty or exactly right. At first glance, Death Race presents itself as a remake. The title is the same. The premise sounds familiar. A deadly competition, drivers fighting for survival, violence turned into spectacle. But the moment you look closer, something becomes very clear. This isn't really a remake, it's a reinvention that leaves most of the original behind. Because if you go back to Death Race 2000, what made that film memorable wasn't just the action, it was the attitude. It had a twisted sense of humor, a biting, almost uncomfortable satire. It didn't just show violence, it mocked the culture that enjoyed watching it. There was irony baked into every crash. There was absurdity behind every kill. There was a clear awareness that the spectacle itself was the joke. But this version, it strips almost all of that away. There's no wink to the audience, no playful edge, no satirical bite cutting beneath the surface. Instead, Death Race takes that same core idea and drives it in the opposite direction, towards seriousness, aggression, and full-blown intensity. The violence is no longer ironic. It's not exaggerated for commentary. It's presented straight, heavy, and brutal. What was once satire becomes spectacle. And that change completely transforms the experience. Because without that layer of commentary, The film stops asking questions. It stops reflecting on the audience, on society, on the nature of entertainment itself. It simply delivers the thing it used to critique. You're no longer watching a movie that plays with the idea of violent entertainment. You're watching a movie that is violent entertainment. And that shift is more important than it might seem, because it reveals something about how the concept has evolved. The original used its low-budget chaos to say something sharp about culture. This version uses its high-budget polish to amplify the chaos itself. Bigger explosions, heavier vehicles, more brutal collisions, less reflection. It's as if the film took the skeleton of the original idea and rebuilt it as a modern industrial product designed for maximum impact. And, to be fair, it does that well. The production is slick, the action is more intense, the scale is larger, everything feels upgraded in a purely technical sense. But at the same time, something essential is lost in that upgrade: the personality, the weirdness, the unpredictability that came from not taking itself too seriously. This version is far more controlled, far more focused, far more streamlined, and because of that, far less distinctive. Even the setting reflects that shift. Where the original had a broader, almost chaotic sense of space and absurdity, this film locks everything into a prison environment, tight, controlled, contained. The chaos is still there, but it's now regulated, organized, managed, which mirrors the film itself. Less wild, more structured, more efficient, but less daring. And that's the core of the transformation. Death Race doesn't fail as a remake because it's poorly made. It diverges because it's trying to be something entirely different. It takes a concept rooted in satire and rebuilds it as a straight-faced action machine. The irony is gone. The humor is gone. The commentary is reduced to a faint echo. What remains is the raw surface, the violence, the competition, the spectacle. And for some viewers, that's enough. Because if you're coming in for destruction, speed, and high-octane action, this version delivers in ways the original never aimed to. It's louder, heavier, and far more intense. But if you're looking for what made the original concept unique, that sharp, uncomfortable edge, that sense that the film was laughing at the very thing it was showing, you won't find it here. And that's what makes Death Race such an interesting case. It's not just a remake that changes details, it's a remake that changes purpose. It takes a story that once questioned spectacle and turns it into spectacle itself. And whether that feels like an upgrade or a loss depends entirely on what you think the race was supposed to be about in the first place. On the surface, Death Race looks like a modern, studio-driven action film clean production. Heavy machinery, controlled chaos, and a level of polish that screams big-budget intent. But scratch beneath that polished exterior, and something much rougher starts to show through. Because at its core, this film isn't just a sleek action blockbuster. It's built on the DNA of exploitation cinema. You can feel it in the way the movie presents violence, not as consequence, but as attraction. The crashes aren't just part of the story, they are the story. The destruction isn't there to support emotion, it replaces it. Every impact, every explosion, every brutal elimination is framed to maximize shock, intensity, and spectacle. That's classic exploitation language. Take the characters. They aren't written for depth, they're designed for function. The hardened inmates, the sadistic guards, the cold, manipulative authority figure, the stoic, wronged protagonist. These aren't layered personalities. They're archetypes built to collide with each other in the most aggressive ways possible. Even the way the film treats its world feels rooted in that tradition. This is a place where cruelty isn't hidden, it's amplified, where punishment becomes entertainment, where suffering is broadcast, consumed, and monetized. The prison isn't just a setting, it's a stage. And everyone inside it is either a performer or part of the spectacle. That's exploitation at its core. Take something dark, something uncomfortable, and push it until it becomes impossible to ignore. But here's where Death Race becomes interesting. Because unlike traditional exploitation films, gritty, low-budget, rough around the edges, this version is wrapped in studio polish. The lighting is controlled, the editing is precise, the vehicles are meticulously designed, the action is choreographed with technical precision. It's exploitation, refined. The raw energy is still there, but it's been packaged, cleaned up, engineered for a wider audience. And that creates a strange contrast. On one hand, the film feels calculated, like every explosion has been carefully planned, every shot designed for maximum visual impact. On the other hand, The underlying impulses are anything but subtle. They're loud, aggressive, and unapologetically crude. Violence is still the main attraction. Sexualized imagery is still used as visual currency. Dominance, power, and brutality still drive the tone. The difference is, it's all been upgraded. What used to feel chaotic and dangerous now feels controlled and commercial. And that changes the experience. Because classic exploitation films often had a kind of unpredictable edge. They felt messy, risky, like anything could happen. That rawness gave them personality even when they were rough or uneven. Death Race, by contrast, is too polished to feel truly dangerous. It delivers the same core elements, violence, excess, shock, but in a way that feels managed, almost safe in its execution, even when the content itself is extreme. It's exploitation without the rough edges. And that raises an interesting question. When you take something that was once raw and rebellious and refine it into a studio product, do you make it better? Or do you strip away what made it distinctive? Because in Death Race, you can still see the bones of that older, harsher filmmaking style. You can still feel the intention to shock, to provoke, to overwhelm. But it's no longer unpredictable. It's been shaped into something more controlled, more marketable, more aligned with modern blockbuster expectations. And yet, it still works. Because even in its polished form, that exploitation energy hasn't disappeared. It's just been redirected, focused, amplified through bigger budgets, heavier machinery, and more precise filmmaking. The film may look like a studio action piece, but underneath all that steel and gloss, it's still running on something much more primal, something louder, something rougher, something built not just to entertain, but to hit. Once the initial chaos settles, Death Race reveals the structure holding everything together, and it's immediately recognizable. Because beneath all the armored cars and explosive spectacle, this is a prison movie at its core. And not just any prison movie. It's built almost entirely from familiar genre machinery. You can see the pieces falling into place almost instantly. The moment Jensen Ames enters the prison, the blueprint is already clear. The hostile environment, the unspoken rules, the tension hanging in every corner. This is a world where survival isn't guaranteed, it's negotiated. And the film doesn't waste time pretending it's reinventing this space. Instead, it leans fully into it. You've got the wrongfully accused protagonist, dropped into a system that's already decided his fate. You've got the corrupt authority figure, pulling strings from above, controlling outcomes from the shadows. You've got the mentor figure, someone who understands the system and knows how to survive within it. You've got the volatile rival, circling, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. And surrounding all of them, a prison population defined more by aggression than individuality. It's all there. Every piece, and the film assembles it quickly, efficiently, almost mechanically. There's no slow exploration of this world, no deep dive into how it operates on a psychological level. Instead, it treats the prison like a pre-built arena, a stage where the rules are already understood, where the hierarchy is already in place, where the only question is how Jensen will navigate it. And that's where the familiarity becomes both a strength and a limitation. Because on one hand, this structure works. It gives the film immediate clarity. You don't need long explanations. You don't need detailed backstories. The moment you see the environment, you understand the stakes. You understand the danger. You understand the power dynamics. The system is broken. The authority is corrupt. The game is rigged. Simple. And that simplicity allows the film to move fast. It doesn't get bogged down in complexity. It uses these familiar elements as a launch pad for the action. But on the other hand, it also means the film rarely surprises you. Because once you recognize the pattern, you can almost predict how things will unfold. You know the system will push Jensen to the edge. You know alliances will form and break. You know the confrontation with the rival is coming. You know the authority figure will tighten control as things escalate. The structure is so well worn that it runs on expectation. And Death Race doesn't try to subvert that expectation, it embraces it. The prison becomes less of a living, breathing world, and more of a controlled environment designed to support the film's real focus, the races. Everything outside the track exists to feed what happens on it. The guards, they enforce the tension. The inmates, they populate the conflict. The system, it creates the stakes. But none of it is explored beyond what's necessary. This isn't a film interested in the psychology of incarceration or the deeper consequences of this environment. It uses the prison as a functional machine, a place where violence is expected, control is absolute, and survival is the only currency that matters. And in that sense, it fits perfectly with the film's overall identity. Because just like everything else in Death Race, the prison isn't about depth, it's about efficiency. It's a framework that allows the story to move quickly, escalate naturally, and justify the brutality at its center without slowing down to question it. It gives the film structure without demanding complexity. And that's the trade-off. You get clarity, you get momentum. You get a world that's instantly understandable. But you lose unpredictability. You lose nuance. You lose the chance for something deeper to emerge from within that system. In the end, the prison in Death Race isn't just a setting, it's a mechanism. A machine designed to produce conflict, control characters, and funnel everything toward the spectacle. And like every other machine in this film, it does exactly what it was built to do. At the center of all the noise, all the chaos, all the metal and fire, there's one figure the film keeps returning to. Jensen Ames. Because no matter how explosive Death Race becomes, it still needs a point of focus, someone to anchor the experience, someone the audience can follow through the madness. And Jensen is built for exactly that role. He's the wronged man, a former driver, a working-class figure trying to hold things together in a collapsing world. And within minutes, everything is taken from him, his life, his freedom, his identity. He's framed, imprisoned, and dropped into a system that doesn't just punish him, it repurposes him. That's what makes Jensen interesting, not because he's deeply complex, but because he's positioned at the center of something much larger than himself. He doesn't choose the race, he doesn't choose the identity, he doesn't even choose the fight. It's all forced onto him. And that lack of control becomes his defining trait. From the moment he steps into the prison, Jensen isn't driving the story, he's reacting to it. Every decision he makes is shaped by pressure, by survival, by the need to navigate a system that's already been rigged against him. And yet, within that pressure, there's something that grounds him, his motivation. Because unlike most of the characters surrounding him, violent, unpredictable, morally hollow, Jensen has something to hold on to, a life beyond the prison, a reason to get out. A personal stake that isn't just about survival, but about reclaiming what was stolen. That's what separates him. In a world where most people exist as part of the spectacle, Jensen becomes the closest thing the film has to an emotional center. He's not just another competitor, he's someone with something to lose. And that matters, because without him, the film would collapse entirely into pure chaos. There would be no perspective, no anchor, no reason to care beyond the next explosion. Jensen gives the audience a way in. But here's where the film takes a different approach. It doesn't build Jensen through long emotional arcs or deep character exploration. Instead, it relies on presence. Jason Statham plays him with restraint, quiet, controlled, almost unreadable at times. There's no over-the-top emotional breakdowns, no dramatic speeches, no heavy exposition explaining how he feels. Everything is internal. It's in the way he watches, the way he reacts, the way he absorbs the pressure around him without breaking. And that works, to a point, because it makes him feel solid, reliable, like someone who can survive this kind of environment. But at the same time, it creates a certain distance. You understand his situation, you understand his motivation, but you don't always feel deeply connected to him. He's compelling, but not deeply emotional. And that's the trade-off the film makes. It chooses a protagonist who fits perfectly into the machinery of the story, someone who can move through the chaos without slowing it down. But in doing so, it limits how much emotional weight he can carry. Even his transformation into Frankenstein reflects that. He's not becoming something new. He's being turned into something. A mask, a symbol, a product. And the more he steps into that role, the more the film raises an interesting tension. Is Jensen still in control of his own story, or is he just playing a part written by the system? That question sits quietly beneath the surface. Because as much as Jensen is trying to survive, to escape, to reclaim his life, he's also being shaped by the very thing he's fighting against. The system needs Frankenstein. The audience demands Frankenstein. And Jensen is forced to become Frankenstein. That conflict between identity and survival, between being a man and being a symbol, is where the character almost reaches something deeper. But the film never fully explores it. Instead, it keeps Jensen moving forward, through the races, through the violence, through the escalating pressure. Always pushing, always reacting, always trying to stay one step ahead of a system designed to control him. And by the time the story reaches its final stretch, Jensen becomes less of a traditional character arc and more of a force of resistance. He's not evolving in a dramatic sense. He's enduring, adapting, fighting back, and that's what ultimately defines him. Jensen Ames isn't the most layered protagonist. He isn't written to be deeply introspective or emotionally complex, but he doesn't need to be. Because in a film built on noise, speed, and destruction, sometimes what you need isn't complexity. You need stability. You need stand in the middle of all that chaos and keep moving forward. And that's exactly what Jensen does. He may not fully carry the emotional weight of the film, but without him, there would be nothing holding it together at all. At some point, Death Race stops being just about cars, crashes, and survival, and reveals something far more unsettling hiding beneath the spectacle. Because the most important driver in this race isn't even a person, it's a persona, Frankenstein. And what makes Frankenstein so powerful isn't who he is, it's the fact that it doesn't matter who he is. The face behind the mask is irrelevant, the man inside the car is replaceable. What matters is the image, the legend, the brand. Frankenstein isn't just a racer, he's the star attraction, the name that sells tickets, the identity that keeps the audience watching. He's not competing in the race, he is the race. And that's where the film quietly introduces one of its most interesting ideas. Because Frankenstein isn't built through character development or personal history, he's constructed, manufactured, maintained by the system itself. The mask hides everything human, no identity, no vulnerability, no individuality, just a symbol designed to endure. And the moment the original driver is gone, the system doesn't pause. It doesn't mourn. It doesn't even acknowledge the loss. It replaces him instantly because the show can't stop. The audience doesn't care about the man. They care about the myth. And that's the real power of Frankenstein. He's not a person you follow. He's an idea you consume. A controlled illusion of dominance, survival, and spectacle. Every race, every kill, every moment on screen builds that illusion. The mask becomes larger than the individual wearing it. The identity becomes permanent, even as the people behind it are disposable. And when Jensen Ames is forced to step into that role, something changes. Because now the story isn't just about survival, it's about identity. Jensen isn't just trying to win races anymore. He's being absorbed into a system that erases who he is and replaces him with something more profitable. He's no longer Jensen, he's Frankenstein. And the more the film pushes that transformation, the more it raises a quiet, unsettling question. At what point does the role become the reality? Because once the mask goes on, it doesn't come off easily. The audience believes in Frankenstein. The system depends on Frankenstein. The entire spectacle is built around Frankenstein, and Jensen is trapped inside it. There's a kind of brilliance in that concept, because it reflects how the world of the film operates. Everything is constructed for consumption. Violence is packaged. Identity is controlled. Even human beings are reduced to roles that can be replaced the moment they stop being useful. Frankenstein is the perfect product. Endless, replaceable, marketable, a myth that survives even when the man doesn't. And yet, the film doesn't fully explore this idea. It uses it. It keeps the focus on the races, on the action, on the immediate stakes. But in the background, that concept keeps lingering. Because every time Jensen wins, every time Frankenstein dominates, every time the crowd cheers, it reinforces something uncomfortable. They're not cheering for a man. They're cheering for a brand. And that's what gives Frankenstein his weight. Not as a character, but as a symbol of how this world works. A world where identity is disposable, where spectacle replaces truth, where the mask matters more than the face. And by the time the film reaches its final stretch, that idea becomes impossible to ignore. Because Jensen may be fighting for his freedom, but Frankenstein was never meant to be free. He was built to last forever. And that's the real trap, not the prison, not the race, not even the violence. But the moment a man stops being seen as a person and becomes something the world refuses to let go of. Beyond the engines, beyond the explosions, beyond the spectacle of steel tearing itself apart, Death Race builds its world on something much darker. Because this isn't just a prison, this is Terminal Island, a place where society didn't just fail, it rebranded its collapse. The film drops you into a near-future reality where the economy has crumbled, systems have broken down, and the lines between justice and profit have completely disappeared. But instead of chaos taking over, something far more calculated steps in. Control, privatization, monetization. In this world, incarceration isn't just punishment, it's business, and Terminal Island is the product. It's isolated, controlled, designed not just to contain people, but to use them. The walls don't just keep inmates in, they keep the spectacle contained, focused, and profitable. Everything about this place feels engineered, not accidental. This isn't a prison that lost control. This is a prison that optimized cruelty. Because here, violence isn't a breakdown of order, it's the foundation of it. The inmates aren't just prisoners, they're assets. The guards aren't just enforcers, they're operators. And the system itself isn't broken, it's working exactly as intended. At the center of it all is the death race, a brutal, weaponized competition broadcast to a global audience. Millions tune in, not out of necessity, but out of appetite. They're watching destruction packaged as entertainment, paying to see human lives reduced to collisions, explosions, and elimination. And that's what makes this world unsettling. Because it's not chaotic, it's organized. Every race is controlled, every outcome is influenced. Every moment is designed for maximum engagement. Terminal Island isn't just a prison, it's a studio, a place where suffering is staged, edited, and sold. And the more you look at it, the more disturbing it becomes. Because the system doesn't hide what it's doing, it doesn't pretend to be fair. It doesn't pretend to be just. It doesn't even pretend to care. It exists to generate profit. And everything else, law, morality, human life, falls behind that objective. What makes this setting powerful is how casually it presents that reality. There's no long explanation, no deep philosophical breakdown. The film shows you the system, lets you understand it, and then moves on. But the implications are heavy. A world where economic collapse leads not to reform, but to exploitation. A world where punishment becomes performance. A world where freedom is no longer a right, but a reward dangled for entertainment value. And at the center of that world is Jensen Ames, not just fighting other drivers, but trapped inside a system that has already decided his worth. Terminal Island doesn't care about justice. It cares about ratings. It cares about control. It cares about keeping the show alive. And that's where the film quietly hints at something deeper. Because if this system exists, if millions are watching, if violence has become this normalized, this commercialized, then the question isn't just about the prison. It's about the world outside it. Who's watching? Who's paying? And why does this system continue to exist? The film never fully answers those questions, but it doesn't need to, because the existence of Terminal Island already says enough. It's a place where society didn't collapse into chaos, it collapsed into entertainment. And once that happens, once violence becomes a product, once human lives become content, there's no real escape. Not from the system, not from the spectacle, and maybe not even from the audience watching it all unfold. At the heart of Death Race, there's something far more disturbing than the crashes, the explosions, or even the brutality on the track. Because this isn't just a race, it's a show, a broadcast, a carefully engineered spectacle designed to be watched, consumed, and, most importantly, paid for. The Death Race isn't chaos, it's programming. Every lap, every collision, every kill, it's all part of a larger system built around one goal: keep the audience engaged. And that changes everything. Because the moment violence becomes entertainment, it stops being about survival and starts being about performance. The drivers aren't just competitors anymore, they're content. They're playing roles in a system that thrives on destruction. Their lives, their pain, their desperation, it's all packaged into something that can be streamed, sold, and replayed. And the most unsettling part? The system works. Millions are watching, millions are paying, millions are cheering. From the outside, the race looks like a battle for freedom, a chance for inmates to earn their way out through skill and endurance. But the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. This isn't about freedom, it's about ratings. Because in a system like this, victory only matters if it's entertaining. The races aren't designed to be fair, they're designed to be spectacular. That's why the track is filled with triggers, traps, and weapon systems that feel almost theatrical. Oil slicks, machine guns, flamethrowers activated not just for strategy, but for show. The entire race unfolds like a live event engineered for maximum impact. It's part sport, part execution, part reality TV, and every element is controlled. The camera angles, the pacing of the action, the rise and fall of tension, even the outcomes aren't entirely left to chance. Because behind the scenes, there's always someone pulling the strings, adjusting the spectacle, shaping the narrative, ensuring that the audience gets exactly what they came for. This is where the illusion breaks. Because what looks like competition is actually production. The racers think they're fighting for survival. The audience knows they're watching a show. And the system sits above both, manipulating everything to keep the machine running. That's what makes the death race so unsettling. Not just the violence, but the organization of it, the way it's structured, the way it's monetized, the way it turns human suffering into something consumable. And within that system, individuality starts to disappear. Drivers become characters. Races become episodes. Victory becomes a storyline. Even Frankenstein, the biggest name on the track, isn't just a competitor. He's a brand. A figure designed to draw attention, to keep viewers hooked, to maintain the illusion that there's something legendary happening on that track. But it's all part of the same machine. A machine that doesn't care who wins. It only cares that people keep watching. And that's the real twist at the center of Death Race. Because while the film focuses on the action, on the survival, on the brutal competition, the real power lies off the track. In the control room, in the system, in the audience itself. The race isn't just happening on the asphalt. It's happening in the way it's presented, the way it's consumed, the way it's turned into a product. And once you see it that way, the entire film shifts. Because suddenly, the question isn't, who's going to win? It's, was winning ever the point? Or was this always just another performance, in a system where the only real victory is keeping the spectacle alive? Once Death Race fully locks into its rhythm, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. This isn't racing. This is war on wheels. Because the moment the cars hit the track, the film abandons any illusion of traditional motorsport. Speed is no longer the main objective. Precision doesn't matter. Strategy, in the conventional sense, barely exists. What matters is destruction. Every vehicle in this world is transformed into something far more dangerous than a racing machine. These aren't cars. They're weapon systems disguised as cars. Reinforced steel plating, mounted machine guns, flamethrowers, oil slicks, mines, smoke screens, each one built not just to survive impact, but to cause it. And the track itself? It's not a course, it's a controlled battlefield. Because what makes the race design so unique and so unsettling is how engineered everything feels. This isn't chaos. It's structured chaos. Drivers don't just react to each other, they interact with the track itself. Crossing specific markers activates weapons, triggers hazards, unlocks advantages. It's not just about driving, it's about timing destruction. In that sense, the race stops feeling like a competition and starts feeling like a system built to escalate. Every lap introduces more danger. Every round raises the stakes. Every sequence pushes the spectacle further. It's carefully layered. The first race establishes the brutality. The second amplifies it. And by the time you reach the final stretch, the film is operating at full intensity, vehicles tearing each other apart, explosions erupting mid-corner, the line between survival and annihilation completely blurred. And right in the middle of that escalation, the film introduces something that perfectly captures its philosophy, the Dreadnot. Not just another competitor, but a statement. This thing doesn't enter the race, it invades it. Heavier, more aggressive, built like a rolling fortress, it shifts the entire dynamic the moment it appears. Suddenly, the race isn't just dangerous, it's overwhelming. It's the film saying, if this wasn't enough before, let's make it worse. And that's exactly how Death Race operates. It doesn't build tension through subtlety. It builds it through addition. More weapons, more chaos, more impact. Everything is designed to escalate until the spectacle reaches its peak. But here's where things get interesting. For all its aggression, the race design carries a very specific kind of logic, one that feels less like real-world competition and more like something else entirely. A system of triggers, power-ups, environmental hazards. It starts to resemble a game. The track becomes a level. The drivers become players. The race becomes a sequence of objectives and eliminations. And that's what gives the action its unique identity. It's not just about watching cars race, it's about watching a mechanism unfold. A structured, repeatable system designed to produce maximum chaos in the most efficient way possible. And yet, for all that structure, the film never loses its sense of physicality. Because beneath the mechanics, there's still weight. Cars don't just explode, they crush. They flip, tear, and collapse with a heaviness that feels real. The practical stunt work adds something crucial here: credibility. You believe these machines could kill. You feel the danger in every collision, and that's what keeps the spectacle grounded, even when the design itself borders on the absurd. But there's a trade-off, because the more the film leans into this escalating, game-like structure, the less it focuses on clarity. At times, the chaos becomes overwhelming. The editing speeds up, the camera cuts tighter, and the spatial awareness begins to slip. You see the impact, but not always the full picture of how it unfolds. It's sensation over precision, and that's a choice. Because Death Race isn't trying to show you a clean, strategic race. It's trying to make you feel like you're inside the collision itself, surrounded by noise, speed, and unpredictability. And when it works, it's exhilarating. Because the race design becomes more than just action, it becomes the film's engine. Everything feeds into it. The story builds toward it. The characters exist within it. The world is shaped around it. It's the centerpiece, the driving force, the reason everything else exists. And by the time the final lap hits, one thing is clear. This was never about who's the fastest. It was about who could survive the longest, in a system designed to make sure almost no one does. In a film overflowing with noise, speed, and visual chaos, one element quietly gives Death Race its most convincing edge: weight. Real, physical, undeniable weight. Because for all its exaggerated violence and over-the-top design, the film does something crucial that many modern action movies struggle with. It makes you feel the impact. This isn't destruction that floats. It doesn't look clean. It doesn't disappear the moment it happens. It lands hard. From the moment the races begin, there's a noticeable difference in how the chaos is presented. Cars don't just collide. They slam into each other with force. Metal doesn't just bend, it crumbles. Vehicles don't spin gracefully. They flip violently, crashing into the ground with a heaviness that feels dangerous. And that's because so much of what you're seeing is grounded in practical stunt work. Real vehicles, real movement, real physics. There's a tangible sense that something solid is being pushed to its limits every time two cars meet at full speed. You can almost feel the inertia behind each collision, the momentum carrying through the frame, the impact rippling outward. It's messy, it's unpredictable. And that's exactly what makes it work. Because when destruction is real, or at least feels real, it carries consequences. Even in a film that doesn't spend much time on emotional stakes, the physical stakes become undeniable. Every crash looks like it could genuinely hurt. Every explosion feels like it has mass behind it. You're not just watching something happen, you're reacting to it. And that's a huge part of why the action in Death Race holds attention, even when the story starts to thin out. The film understands that spectacle alone isn't enough. It needs texture, that grinding of metal, that shattering of glass, that violent jolt when a car flips end over end. It's all about creating a sense that the world on screen is solid, that the destruction has resistance, that nothing comes apart too easily. And in an era where so much action is dominated by weightless digital effects, that physicality stands out. Because CGI can create bigger explosions, but it often struggles to create believable ones. Here, even when digital elements are present, they're anchored by something real, something you can see, feel, and almost instinctively understand. The laws of motion are still in play. The damage looks earned. And that gives the film a kind of credibility within its own absurdity. No matter how exaggerated the weapons become, no matter how chaotic the races get, the crashes themselves still feel grounded. But that realism also comes with a subtle side effect. It makes the violence more intense. Because when destruction feels real, it stops being abstract. It stops being something you can easily detach from. Even in a film that doesn't dwell on consequences, the physical brutality of the action makes it harder to completely ignore what's happening. You see the impact, you feel the force, you recognize the danger. And that's why even the end credit disclaimer about professional drivers hits differently. After everything you've just watched, it doesn't feel like a formality. It feels like a reminder. A reminder that beneath all the spectacle, there's real risk, real skill, real control required to bring this level of chaos to life, and that knowledge adds another layer to the experience. Because suddenly, the film isn't just showing destruction, it's demonstrating how close it comes to reality. Of course, it's not perfect. There are moments where the editing becomes too frantic, where the camera cuts too quickly, where the clarity of the action gets lost in the attempt to amplify intensity. Sometimes, the film sacrifices orientation for sensation, leaving you with flashes of impact rather than a full understanding of how it unfolds. But even in those moments, the weight remains. You may not always track every movement, but you feel every hit, and that's what Death Race gets right. Because at its core, this isn't just about speed or spectacle, it's about impact. Not just what you see, but what you feel when metal collides, when machines break, when momentum finally meets resistance. And in that sense, the film doesn't just show destruction, it makes you experience it. If Death Race feels like a machine, it's because it's being driven by a director who builds films exactly like one. Paul W.S. Anderson doesn't approach this movie as a storyteller first. He approaches it as an engineer of momentum, and you can feel that in every frame. From the pacing to the visuals to the way scenes transition into each other, the film moves with a kind of mechanical precision. It doesn't drift, it doesn't wander, it doesn't pause to reflect, it pushes forward. Always, because Anderson's style isn't about subtlety, it's about pressure. You see it in the editing, fast cuts, rapid transitions, images colliding into each other just like the cars on the track. You see it in the visuals, steel, smoke, sparks, close-ups of engines, gears, weapons, everything shot like it's part of a larger machine, and you see it in the pacing. There's almost no downtime. The film doesn't give you space to settle. The moment one sequence ends, another begins. Dialogue scenes feel compressed, stripped down to their bare essentials, just enough to move the plot forward before the next burst of action takes over. This is industrial filmmaking. Clean, controlled, relentless, and in many ways, it works. Because Anderson understands exactly what kind of movie he's making. He's not chasing emotional depth or layered storytelling. He's building a system designed to deliver consistent impact. Every decision is made with that goal in mind. Keep the energy high. Keep the movement constant. Never let the audience disengage. And for long stretches, that approach is effective. The film rarely feels slow. It rarely drags. Even when the narrative starts to show cracks, the momentum carries you forward. There's always something happening, always something moving, always something exploding. It's like being locked inside a machine that refuses to stop. But that same strength also reveals the film's biggest limitation. Because when everything is built around momentum, there's very little room left for anything else. There's no space for subtle character development, no time for emotional buildup, no patience for thematic exploration. Everything gets compressed. Characters become functional. Scenes become transitional. Moments that could have been meaningful are reduced to brief checkpoints between action sequences. It's not that Anderson can't create atmosphere or tension. It's that this film isn't designed to sustain it. It's designed to accelerate. And that acceleration comes with excess. Because when a film never slows down, it has to keep increasing intensity to maintain engagement. More explosions, bigger crashes, louder sequences. The scale keeps rising, not because the story demands it, but because the momentum does. And that leads to a kind of controlled overload. At times, it's exhilarating. At times, it's exhausting. Because the film doesn't just move fast, it moves aggressively. It throws information, visuals, and action at you in rapid succession, trusting that the sheer force of it will keep you engaged. And often, it does. But there are moments where that speed starts to blur the experience, where the editing becomes too quick, the action too fragmented, the clarity sacrificed for intensity. You feel the impact, but you don't always see the full picture. It's the difference between watching a collision and being inside it. And Anderson clearly prefers the latter. He wants you to feel overwhelmed, to be caught in the chaos. To experience the film as something happening around you, not something you're calmly observing. That's his signature. Style over subtlety, momentum over meaning, impact over introspection, and within that framework, Death Race might actually be one of his more controlled efforts. Because despite all the excess, there's still a sense of structure. The races are clearly defined. The escalation is deliberate. The film knows where it's going, even if it doesn't always explore why. It's not random chaos, it's organized aggression, And that's what defines Anderson's direction here. He builds a film that behaves like the world it portrays, mechanical, controlled, relentless. A system designed to keep moving, keep escalating, and keep delivering impact until the very end. And whether that feels thrilling or overwhelming depends on how long you can stay inside the machine before you start looking for a way out. Visually, Death Race knows exactly what it wants to be. Cold, industrial, aggressive. From the moment you enter Terminal Island, the world is drenched in steel, smoke, and concrete. The color palette leans into grays, blacks, and muted tones, giving everything a harsh, metallic texture. Nothing feels clean. Nothing feels polished in a traditional sense. It feels worn, used, brutal, and that works, because this isn't a futuristic world built on sleek technology. It's a world built on decay. A place where machines are patched together, where environments feel suffocating, where every surface looks like it's been through violence before. The cinematography captures that tone effectively. Close-ups of engines, tight framing on weapons, sweat, grease, sparks flying across the screen. Everything is shot to emphasize texture and intensity. The camera doesn't just observe the action, it gets right up against it, almost forcing you into the environment. And when the film slows down, just for a moment, you can actually see flashes of strong visual storytelling. The composition, the lighting, the sense of scale, it's all there. But then the film does something that both defines it and limits it. It speeds up a lot, because while the visual style is strong, the editing often becomes the film's biggest obstacle. The cuts come fast, sometimes too fast. Action sequences are broken into rapid fragments, shots lasting only a moment before jumping to the next angle. The camera moves aggressively, the perspective shifts constantly, and instead of building clarity, the film leans into chaos. At its best, this creates energy. You feel the speed. You feel the impact. You feel like you're inside the collision. But at its worst, it creates confusion. You see cars crashing, but you're not always sure how they got there. You see explosions, but the spatial relationships become unclear. You feel the intensity, but you lose the sense of direction. And that's the trade-off the film makes. It prioritizes sensation over clarity. The goal isn't always to show you exactly what's happening. It's to make you feel like something intense is happening. And while that can be effective in short bursts, over time it starts to blur the experience. Because action works best when you understand it, when you can track movement, when you can follow cause and effect, when you can see how one moment leads to the next. In Death Race, that connection isn't always clear. The races, despite their scale and design, sometimes lose their spatial coherence. You're not always sure how far apart drivers are. You don't always understand who's leading, who's catching up, or how close anyone is to the finish. And that weakens tension, because tension comes from awareness. If you don't fully understand the situation, it becomes harder to feel the stakes within it. There are moments where the film could have elevated itself simply by pulling back, holding a shot longer, letting the action breathe, allowing the audience to take in the full scope of what's happening. But instead, it cuts. Again and again, it zooms, it shifts, it fragments. And while that keeps the energy high, it also makes the experience feel slightly unstable. Almost like the film doesn't trust the action to speak for itself, which is ironic. Because when the movie does slow down, when it lets a crash unfold in full view, when it holds on a moment of impact, when it allows the physicality of the stunt work to register, that's when it feels the most powerful. That's when you see the weight, the scale, the danger. But those moments are often buried beneath layers of rapid editing. And that's where the film misses an opportunity. Because the visual style is strong, the world is convincing, the action is physically grounded, all the elements are there for something truly impactful. But the execution keeps pushing toward intensity instead of balance. Still, this approach isn't accidental. It reflects the film's overall philosophy. Fast, aggressive, unrelenting. Even the editing behaves like the cars, constantly moving, constantly colliding, never stopping long enough to fully settle. And for some viewers, that works, because it creates a sense of immersion through chaos. It puts you inside the noise, inside the motion, inside the impact. But for others, it feels like the film is moving so fast, cutting so quickly, pushing so hard, that it forgets to let you see the race clearly before it's already on to the next explosion. And in a movie built entirely around action, that clarity matters more than anything. In a film like Death Race, sound isn't just background, it's supposed to be fuel. The engines roar, the metal clashes, the explosions hit. And ideally, the music should sit right alongside all of that, amplifying the experience, pushing the adrenaline higher, turning every moment into something that sticks. But here's where things get interesting, because while Death Race is undeniably loud, its soundtrack doesn't always feel powerful. It feels functional. The score, composed by Paul Haslinger, does exactly what it's supposed to do on a technical level. It supports the action. It maintains rhythm. It keeps the energy consistent as the film moves from one sequence to the next. But it rarely does more than that. It doesn't rise above the moment. It doesn't define scenes. It doesn't create something memorable that lingers after the engines stop. Instead, it blends in. And in a movie built on intensity, blending in can feel like a missed opportunity. Because this kind of film needs music that hits just as hard as the visuals. It needs something that doesn't just accompany the action, but drives it. Something that makes a race feel bigger. Something that turns a collision into a moment. Something that stays with you after the scene is over. But here, the score often feels like it's stuck in a constant warm-up mode. It keeps things moving, but rarely pushes them higher. And then there's the use of licensed tracks. On paper, it makes sense. Heavy, aggressive music to match the tone of the film. But in execution, some of these choices feel slightly off. Instead of enhancing the moment, they sometimes pull attention away from it. You notice the song instead of feeling the scene, and that creates a disconnect. Because in the middle of high-speed chaos, the last thing you want is to become aware of the soundtrack as a separate element. The best action scores disappear into the experience. They become part of the momentum, part of the energy, part of the emotion. Here, that connection isn't always seamless. It's not that the music is bad, it's that it's rarely essential, and that's the difference. A great soundtrack elevates a film. It transforms scenes. It adds identity. A functional soundtrack simply supports what's already there, and that's where Death Race lands. It has the noise. It has the aggression. It has the volume. But it doesn't always have the musical impact to match the visuals, which is surprising because this is a film that thrives on sensation. The engines are unforgettable, the crashes are unforgettable, the spectacle leaves an impression, but the music, it fades, and that absence becomes more noticeable the longer the film goes on. Because imagine those same races, those same collisions, backed by a score that truly drives the experience, something that builds tension, releases it, and then pushes it even further. It could have added another layer entirely. Instead, the soundtrack remains just beneath the surface, doing its job, keeping the pace, but never quite taking control. And in a film where everything else is trying to hit as hard as possible, that restraint feels less like a choice and more like a missed opportunity. In a film built on speed, violence, and spectacle, performances aren't meant to carry emotional depth. They're meant to fit the machine. And in Death Race, that's exactly what the cast does. They don't stretch the material, they align with it. At the center is Jason Statham as Jensen Ames, and this is territory he understands perfectly. He doesn't overplay the role. He doesn't force emotion. He doesn't try to turn Jensen into something more complex than the film allows. Instead, he leans into control, a quiet, contained intensity, a presence that feels solid, grounded, unshaken, even as chaos explodes around him. Statham isn't trying to dominate scenes with dramatic range. He's anchoring them with physical credibility. You believe him behind the wheel. You believe him in a fight. You believe he can survive in this world. And in a movie like this, that's more important than anything else, because Jensen doesn't need to be deeply expressive. He needs to be reliable. A steady center in a film that rarely slows down, and Statham delivers exactly that. Then there's Joan Allen as Warden Hennessy, and this is where things shift, because Allen brings a completely different kind of energy, cold, controlled, calculated. She plays Hennessy with a kind of icy precision that makes her feel less like a person and more like the system itself. Every word is measured. Every decision is driven by control, profit, and power. But here's the catch. The performance is strong, but the character is written so broadly that it limits what Allen can do with it. Hennessy isn't subtle. She isn't layered. She's relentlessly ruthless. And as the film pushes that trait further and further, she starts to feel exaggerated, almost theatrical in her cruelty. Not because Allen overplays it, but because the script leaves no room for nuance. She becomes an idea, the embodiment of corruption. And while that works within the film's tone, it also means the performance never fully evolves. It stays locked in that same cold, dominant register from beginning to end. Ian McShane, on the other hand, brings something the film desperately needs: weight. As coach, he doesn't try to compete with the chaos. He grounds it. There's a calmness to his performance, a sense of experience. He feels like someone who understands the system, who's survived it long enough to know how it works and how to navigate it. He doesn't need big moments. His presence alone adds credibility. And in a film where everything is constantly escalating, that kind of stability matters. Tyrese Gibson as Machine Gun Joe brings yet another flavor: energy. Loud, volatile, unpredictable. He's not there to be subtle, he's there to disrupt. Every time he's on screen, there's a sense that something could go wrong, or at least get louder. He leans into the chaos, embraces the aggression, and becomes one of the few characters who feels like he's actually enjoying the violence. For some viewers, that works. For others, it can feel a bit exaggerated, but either way, he leaves an impression. And in a film where many characters blur together, that counts. Around them, the supporting cast fills out the world with a lineup of hardened archetypes. Max Ryan's Pachenko brings brute menace, especially tied to Jensen's personal revenge. Jason Clarke adds a layer of intimidation as one of the prison enforcers. Faces like Robin Shaw and Robert Lasardo appear with recognizable presence, even if they're given limited space to stand out. And that's the recurring pattern. Most of these characters aren't developed, they're deployed. They exist to serve specific functions within the story: the rival, the enforcer, the threat, the obstacle. And once they've fulfilled that role, they're gone. There's very little room for growth, very little room for complexity. The film doesn't slow down long enough to explore who these people are beyond their immediate purpose. Natalie Martinez as Case sits somewhere in between. She brings presence, charisma, and a sense of partnership within the race itself. There's a natural ease to her performance that makes her likable on screen. But again, the writing limits her. She's positioned as the navigator, the ally, the visual counterpart to Jensen, but the film never fully develops her beyond that. There are hints of something more, but they're never explored deeply. And that's what defines the performances in Death Race as a whole. They work. They fit the tone. They support the action. They keep the film moving. But they're rarely asked to do more. Because this isn't a film built on character depth. It's built on momentum. So instead of performances that evolve, you get performances that hold steady. Statham anchors, Allen dominates, McShane grounds, Tyrese disrupts, and everyone else fills in the gaps. And within that framework, the cast does exactly what it needs to do. They don't elevate the film beyond its limitations, but they make sure it never falls apart inside them. For all the noise, the speed, and the relentless spectacle, there's one thing Death Race never fully delivers: depth. Because beneath all the explosions and high-octane chaos, the film's characters are surprisingly thin. Not broken, not poorly acted, just underdeveloped. And that becomes more noticeable the longer the film goes on. At first, it's easy to overlook. The pacing is fast. The races are intense. The world is aggressive. You're pulled into the momentum, and there's not much time to stop and question what's missing. But once you step back, you start to see it. Most of the characters don't feel like people. They feel like positions: the rival, the mentor, the villain, the enforcer, the ally. Each one defined by a single function, and rarely allowed to grow beyond it. They enter the story with a clear purpose, fulfill that purpose, and then either disappear or get eliminated, often in the most literal sense. And that's the key word here: disposable. Because in the world of Death Race, characters aren't just expendable within the story. They're treated that way by the film itself. Introduced quickly, defined instantly, removed just as fast. There's very little time spent building who they are beyond what they represent. Backstories are minimal. Motivations are simplified. Relationships are functional rather than emotional. You understand what each character does, but you rarely understand who they are, and that creates a kind of emotional distance. Because when characters aren't fully developed, their outcomes don't carry the same weight. When someone crashes, burns, or gets eliminated, it registers visually, but not emotionally. You see it happen, but you don't feel it. Even the relationships in the film follow this pattern. Alliances form, but they're built on necessity rather than connection. Trust is implied rather than earned. Interactions move quickly, serving the plot rather than deepening the characters. There are moments where something more could have emerged: hints of history, fragments of tension, glimpses of personality. But the film never stays long enough to explore them, because it can't. It's always moving, always pushing forward, and that momentum comes at a cost. Even Jensen, the central figure, feels the effects of this approach. While he's more defined than anyone else, his emotional journey remains controlled, contained, and somewhat distant. You understand his motivation, but you're not fully immersed in his experience. And for the supporting cast, that gap becomes even wider. Characters like Pachenko, Machine Gun Joe, the guards, the other inmates, they exist primarily as obstacles or extensions of the environment. They're there to create conflict, to escalate tension, to populate the world with danger. But once they've served that purpose, they're gone. No aftermath, no reflection, no lasting impact, and that reinforces something about the film's identity. Because Death Race isn't designed to make you invest in people, it's designed to make you invest in events. The next race, the next crash, the next explosion. The characters are part of that machinery, but they're not the focus of it. And in a way, that mirrors the world the film is portraying. A system where individuals are reduced to roles, where lives are expendable, where identity is secondary to function. The film doesn't just show that idea, it operates by it, which is why the lack of depth doesn't feel accidental. It feels intentional. But intentional doesn't always mean effective. Because while this approach keeps the pacing tight and the structure efficient, it also limits how much the film can resonate on a deeper level. You're engaged by what's happening, but you're not connected to who it's happening to, and that's the trade-off. You get speed, you get clarity, you get constant movement, but you lose emotional weight, you lose complexity, you lose the chance for these characters to become more than just pieces in the game. In the end, Death Race treats its characters the same way it treats its cars, built for impact, used for performance, and ultimately, replaceable. There's a moment early on in Death Race where the film stops feeling like just an action movie and starts revealing exactly who it was built for. Because everything about this film, its tone, its visuals, its energy, is carefully calibrated toward a very specific kind of appeal. This is hyper-masculine cinema, not subtly, not accidentally, but deliberately, aggressively, and consistently. You see it in the way the world is framed. The men are hard, aggressive, physically dominant. They speak in short, direct lines. They solve problems with force. They're defined by strength, endurance, and control. Every interaction is built around power, who has it, who's losing it, and who's about to take it. And the environment reflects that same energy. Steel, fire, impact. Everything is loud, heavy, and confrontational. Even the way the action is staged reinforces it, cars smashing into each other, weapons firing, bodies thrown into chaos. It's not just violence, it's force as identity. But just as noticeable is how the film presents its female characters. They're framed differently, styled, positioned, highlighted in a way that often feels less about character and more about visual impact. The camera lingers, the presentation becomes deliberate, almost ornamental at times. And this contrast isn't random. It's part of the film's design. Because Death Race isn't just telling a story, it's constructing an experience tailored for a specific audience expectation. The combination of aggression, speed, and stylized imagery creates a kind of cinematic language that's instantly recognizable. Fast cars, explosive action, dominant male figures, visually stylized female presence. It's a formula, and the film leans into it without hesitation. There's no attempt to balance it, no effort to soften it. It embraces that identity fully, building a world where everything feeds into that same tone. Testosterone-driven, visually charged, and unapologetically direct. And to be fair, it works. Because for the audience it's targeting, this approach delivers exactly what's expected. There's a clarity to it, a lack of confusion about what the film is offering. It doesn't try to appeal to everyone. It doesn't try to expand its emotional range. It stays focused. But that focus comes with limitations. Because the more the film leans into this hyper-masculine design, the narrower its perspective becomes. Characters become defined by archetypes. Interactions become simplified. The world becomes less about complexity and more about presentation. Even moments that could have explored deeper relationships or emotional nuance are shaped by this same lens. Everything is filtered through the film's core identity, aggression, dominance, and spectacle, and that leaves very little room for variation. What's interesting, though, is how this ties back into the larger themes of the film. Because just like the characters are reduced to roles, the presentation itself becomes part of the system. Everything is designed to be consumed. The violence, the competition, the personalities, the imagery. It's all packaged in a way that aligns perfectly with the in-world spectacle, the idea that everything inside this prison exists for an audience. So, in a way, the film isn't just targeting an audience, it's mirroring one. A world where aggression is entertainment, where power is spectacle, where image matters as much as action. And that's what makes this aspect of Death Race feel both intentional and revealing. Because it doesn't just show you the race, it shows you how it's being sold. And once you notice that, it becomes clear. This isn't just a film built on speed and violence, it's a film built on appeal, carefully shaped, visually calculated, and designed to hit a very specific audience, exactly where it knows it will land. For all the noise, the speed, and the spectacle, Death Race follows a path that feels surprisingly familiar. Because once the engines settle into rhythm, the story underneath reveals itself to be built on something very recognizable: formula. You can almost map it out from the beginning. A wrongfully accused man is thrown into a brutal system. A corrupt authority figure controls the game. A rival stands in his way. A promise of freedom drives him forward, and somewhere along the line, the truth behind the system begins to surface. We've seen this structure before, and Death Race doesn't try to hide it. It leans into it. From the early moments, the trajectory becomes clear. You know where Jensen's journey is heading. You can feel the key beats coming before they arrive. The alliances, the betrayals, the confrontations, they all follow a pattern that's easy to recognize, and that predictability isn't necessarily a problem on its own. In action cinema, familiar structure can be a strength. It gives the audience something to hold on to. It allows the film to move quickly without getting lost in complexity. But here's where things start to weaken. Because while the structure is familiar, the execution doesn't always hold up under pressure, and that's where the logic gaps begin to show. The system controlling the race feels powerful, but also inconsistent. Rules are enforced when it suits the narrative, and ignored when the story needs to move in a different direction. Security systems fail at convenient moments. Opportunities appear exactly when they're needed. Certain plot developments rely more on timing than on cause and effect. It creates a sense that the world is less governed by internal logic and more by narrative convenience, and over time, that starts to chip away at the tension. Because tension relies on belief, you don't need a story to be perfectly realistic, but you need it to feel consistent. You need to understand how the system works, what the rules are, and what the consequences will be if those rules are broken. In Death Race, those boundaries are often blurred, and that makes the stakes feel less solid. You're watching events unfold, but you're not always convinced by how they're happening. Then there's the dialogue. It does its job, it moves the story forward, but much of it feels pulled from familiar action movie territory, direct, functional, and sometimes predictable. Characters say what they need to say to keep things moving, but rarely more than that. There's very little that surprises you, very little that adds new layers. It's efficient, but not distinctive, and that's the recurring theme. Everything in the narrative is built for efficiency. The story doesn't waste time exploring complexity. It doesn't linger on ambiguity. It doesn't challenge its own structure. It follows the path it knows and moves forward. But that also means it rarely rises above expectation. Moments that should feel like turning points often feel like checkpoints. Twists arrive, but they're easy to anticipate. Revelations happen, but they don't shift the experience as much as they should. Even the climax reflects this. After all the build-up, all the escalation, all the tension, the resolution unfolds in a way that feels expected. The pieces fall into place, but not in a way that feels surprising or deeply earned. It's satisfying on a surface level, but not impactful. And that's the difference between a story that works and a story that resonates. Death Race works. It moves, it functions, it delivers the necessary beats, but it rarely pushes beyond that. It doesn't take risks with its narrative. It doesn't challenge the audience's expectations. It doesn't aim to surprise. It aims to deliver. And in doing so, it becomes exactly what it's designed to be: a streamlined, formula-driven story built to support the action. Nothing more, nothing less. Which brings us back to the core question of the film: is that enough? Because if you're here for the races, the crashes, the spectacle, then the story does its job. But if you're looking for something that breaks the pattern, that adds depth, that surprises you, you might find yourself seeing every turn long before the wheels even start to move. Beneath all the firepower, all the speed, all the spectacle, Death Race is really built on one central idea. The game is rigged. From the moment Jensen Ames enters Terminal Island, the illusion is already in place. Freedom is presented as a prize. Victory is presented as a path out. The race is presented as a fair chance. But the deeper you go, the clearer it becomes. None of it is real. Because this system isn't designed to give anyone freedom, it's designed to control the illusion of it. That's the difference. On the surface, the death race looks like opportunity. Win enough races, survive long enough, and you earn your way out. It's a simple, powerful promise, one that keeps the drivers pushing forward, risking everything, believing that there's something waiting on the other side. But behind that promise, there's manipulation. Every race is monitored. Every outcome is influenced. Every rule can be adjusted. The system decides when things are fair and when they're not. And that means the drivers aren't just competing against each other. They're competing against a structure that was never built to let them win. At the center of that structure is control. Warden Hennessy doesn't just oversee the races, she orchestrates them. She manages the spectacle, shapes the narrative, and ensures that the show delivers exactly what it needs to. Ratings matter more than results. Profit matters more than fairness. Control matters more than truth. And once you understand that, the entire concept of the race changes, because it's no longer about who's the best driver. It's about who can survive long enough in a system that benefits from their suffering. That's where the illusion comes in. The illusion of choice, the illusion of progress, the illusion that freedom is just one more victory away. But in reality, the system is always one step ahead. It creates hope just to maintain control. Because hope keeps the drivers moving, hope keeps the audience watching. Hope keeps the entire machine running, and that's what makes it so effective. The drivers believe they're fighting for something real. The audience believes they're watching something authentic. But everything is being shaped from above. Outcomes adjusted, stories controlled, identities manufactured. Even Jensen's journey reflects this. He's not just trying to win races, he's trying to break out of a system that has already written his role. The more he uncovers, the more he realizes that survival alone isn't enough. Because even if he wins, the system still holds the power to decide what happens next. And that's the real trap. Not the prison walls, not the race itself, but the structure surrounding it. A structure that gives just enough freedom to keep people playing, but never enough to truly escape. That's why every victory feels uncertain. Because you're never sure if it actually changes anything. You're never sure if the rules will hold. You're never sure if the promise will be kept. And that uncertainty erodes the stakes. Because if the system can change the outcome at any moment, then what does winning really mean? That question lingers throughout the film. Because Death Race isn't just showing a brutal competition, it's showing a controlled environment where control is everything. The drivers are pawns. The race is the board. And the real game is happening somewhere else entirely. And as Jensen pushes closer to the finish line, one thing becomes clear. This was never a fair fight. It was a performance, a system designed to look like opportunity while ensuring that no one ever truly escapes it. And once you see that, the race stops being about speed and becomes about something far more dangerous, breaking the rules of a game that was never meant to be won. Here's what makes Death Race strangely fascinating. It knows it has something deeper to say. You can see it. You can feel it. It's right there beneath the surface. A collapsing economy, privatized prisons, violence turned into entertainment, people reduced to products, a system built on control, profit, and public appetite. These aren't small ideas. In another film, they would be the centerpiece. But in Death Race, they're more like background noise. Because every time the film gets close to exploring these themes, really exploring them, it does something very specific. It pulls away, back to the engines, back to the explosions, back to the spectacle, and that's the central tension of the movie. It has the foundation for commentary, but chooses action instead. Again and again, you see glimpses of something sharper. The idea that society has normalized violence as entertainment. The idea that systems of power profit from human suffering. The idea that identity can be manufactured, controlled, and sold. All of it is there.